I removed the pump exactly as ordered, on a Tuesday afternoon, hauling it out from the corner of my backyard where it had sat quietly for 11 years, and by Friday morning, I was fielding panicked phone calls from neighbors 3 streets over asking why their sprinkler systems had suddenly stopped producing anything but a weak, sputtering trickle. A question I answered honestly, and with considerably less sympathy than perhaps I should have mustered, given how thoroughly I had warned the HOA board exactly what would happen. My name is Rosalind Echterberg Delacroix. I live in Hollow Pines Estates, a community of about 200 homes built, unusually, around a shared irrigation system rather than individual municipal water connections for landscaping purposes, an arrangement established by the original developer nearly 2 decades earlier that draws from a private well on what was, at the time of the community's construction, the edge of the development, pressurizing and distributing water to the community's shared irrigation network that feeds not just the common area landscaping, but, through a legacy agreement most current residents had entirely forgotten existed, a significant portion of individual homeowners own lawn sprinkler systems as well. I want to establish something clearly, because it matters enormously for everything that follows. That well and its associated pump system sit on my property, specifically because my house was built on what had originally been designated, in the community's founding documents, as a utility easement lot, purchased by my husband Desmond and me 9 years ago from a previous owner who had, apparently, either never fully understood or simply never mentioned the significance of the large, unglamorous pump housing sitting in the back corner of what was otherwise an entirely ordinary residential yard. I want to walk you through how I came to fully understand this myself, because I did not, initially, realize the pump's true significance either. For the first 2 years we lived there, I assumed, much like I suspect most of our neighbors did, that it was simply some kind of community utility infrastructure that happened to be located on our lot, unremarkable and easily ignored, functioning quietly in the background without any real attention from me until the day it became, unexpectedly, the center of a genuinely absurd HOA dispute. The woman responsible for what happened is named Priscilla Wentworth Ashcombe, president of our HOA board for about a year and a half by the time this story starts. I want to walk you through her specific priorities during that tenure, because they matter for understanding how this entire situation unfolded with such striking carelessness. Priscilla had, from fairly early in her presidency, focused considerable energy on what she described in various newsletters as elevating community curb appeal, a priority that manifested in an increasingly aggressive citation campaign, targeting anything visible from the street that struck her as inconsistent with what she considered an appropriately polished residential aesthetic. The pump housing, a somewhat industrial-looking metal structure roughly the size of a small shed, sitting toward the back corner of my property, but, due to our lot's specific layout, visible from the street at a certain angle, became her target about 2 months before this story reaches its climax. I received a citation describing it as an unauthorized industrial structure inconsistent with residential aesthetic standards, demanding its removal within 30 days. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Priscilla directly after receiving that citation, because I explained, as clearly and directly as I possibly could, exactly what that structure actually was. I told her it was the community's shared irrigation well pump, installed by the original developer, servicing not just common area landscaping, but a significant portion of individual homeowners' own sprinkler systems through a legacy water rights agreement that predated the current HOA governance structure entirely, and that removing it would not simply address an aesthetic concern. It would cut off water access for a substantial portion of the neighborhood's landscaping irrigation. Priscilla's response, delivered with a confidence I found genuinely difficult to understand given the specificity of what I just explained, was that she was not aware of any such community-wide dependency, and that, regardless, the structure's appearance remained inconsistent with community standards, and that if it truly served an essential community function, the board would explore relocating it to a less visible location as a separate matter, but that in the meantime, the citation and its associated compliance timeline would remain in effect. I want to sit with the specific absurdity of that response for a moment, because Priscilla was, in effect, telling me that an aesthetic citation would proceed on its original timeline, regardless of whether the structure in question served as the primary water source for a significant portion of the community's irrigation. A position that struck me, even in that first conversation, as either a genuine failure to grasp the practical consequences of what she was demanding, or a decision to simply not care, prioritizing her curb appeal initiative over what I understood, even without yet fully confirming the details myself, to be a fairly significant piece of shared community infrastructure. I want to walk you through the research I did over the following 2 weeks, because I wanted to be absolutely certain of the pump's actual scope and significance before deciding how to respond to what was clearly becoming an unreasonable and poorly informed enforcement action. I contacted the community's original developer, still operating regionally and maintaining some records from Hollow Pines Estate's original construction, and obtained documentation confirming exactly what I'd explained to Priscilla, that the well and pump system served, through the original legacy agreement, irrigation for the community's common areas, along with individually connected sprinkler systems for approximately 60 of the community's 200 homes. Those built during the development's earlier construction phases, when individual municipal irrigation connections weren't yet standard practice for the builder. I submitted this documentation formally to the board, along with a written warning, dated and sent well in advance of the compliance deadline, explaining in explicit terms that removing the pump would immediately cut off irrigation water access for those 60 connected households, and requesting the citation be rescinded, or, at minimum, the compliance timeline suspended pending a proper review of the community's actual water infrastructure dependency on that specific pump. I received, in response, a brief acknowledgement from the management office confirming receipt of my documentation, but no substantive change to the citation or its compliance deadline. I want to tell you about the decision I ultimately made, because I want to be honest that it was not born out of any desire to cause chaos, but out of a genuine, exhausted recognition that I had done everything reasonably possible to warn the board of the consequences, and that continuing to fight a losing battle against an increasingly stubborn 30-day compliance clock, one that carried escalating daily fines if I simply ignored it, made considerably less sense than simply complying exactly as instructed and allowing the board to discover, firsthand, precisely what they'd actually ordered. I hired a contractor to properly and safely disconnect and remove the pump on the Tuesday the compliance deadline arrived, done correctly, with the well itself safely capped rather than left in any hazardous condition, exactly as any responsible removal should be handled. And then I waited,